They weren't all criminals. Some were movie stars. Some were producers. Some were just men who understood that Hollywood and the underworld were never truly separate, only reflections of the same hunger for power, money, and immortality. In the decades after Prohibition, organized crime had built an empire out of gambling and nightclubs. Hollywood, meanwhile, had built its own out of dreams. It didn't take long for the two worlds to collide. The mob wanted legitimacy, the studios wanted protection, and in the middle stood the men who knew too much. They moved between the sets and the casinos, between the boardrooms and the back rooms. They signed contracts by day and made deals by night. They partied with stars, funded their films, and buried their scandals. They were both insiders and outcasts, men trusted by everyone and protected by no one. George Raft, the actor whose real friends were gangsters. Bugsy Siegel, the gangster who wanted to be a movie star. Johnny Rosselli, the quiet negotiator who kept the peace between Hollywood and the mob. Mickey Cohen, the king of Los Angeles, who made stars and ruined lives. And Robert Mitchum, the rebel who walked too close to danger and somehow survived. They believed knowledge was power, but in Hollywood, knowing too much was the most dangerous role a man could play. George Raft, the actor who danced with the mob. Before he ever stepped in front of a camera, George Raft was already famous, not as an actor, but as a dancer. He grew up in Hell's Kitchen, New York, in the same neighborhood that raised gangsters instead of movie stars. He knew the street codes, the faces, the rules of survival. So when he found his way to Hollywood, he brought something no one else in town had: authenticity. In the early 1930s, Raft's career exploded. He played gangsters with a charm that felt too real. Audiences believed every glare, every flick of his hand, every moment of quiet menace. What they didn't know was that George Raft wasn't acting. He was remembering. His childhood friends were now powerful men. Oni Madden, Bugsy Siegel, Lucky Luciano. Names that were whispered in clubs and shouted in police reports. They watched Raft's rise from afar, amused that one of their own had made it in Hollywood. When he visited New York, he was treated like royalty. He wasn't a made man, but he was protected, a symbol of what the underworld could achieve when it wore a tuxedo instead of a gun. Hollywood noticed. So did the FBI. Raft's phone calls were monitored, his friendships cataloged. But he didn't care. He used his connections to survive in an industry as cutthroat as any street corner. When studio heads needed introductions to nightclub owners or private investors, Raft arranged them. When productions shot in Las Vegas, he helped smooth things over, ensuring no one made the wrong kind of enemy. It made him valuable. It also made him dangerous. He turned down roles that glorified informants, claiming he wouldn't betray the people who inspired him. He refused to appear in The Godfather decades later, saying, "I've lived that life once. I don't need to play it." But loyalty had a price. As the 1940s ended, the FBI tightened its investigation into Hollywood's mob ties. Casinos were being raided, and familiar faces were vanishing. George Raft's name appeared again and again in reports, tied to figures like Siegel and Johnny Rosselli. Then came the fall. In 1946, Siegel was killed in his Beverly Hills home, a message from the same organization that once protected him. For Raft, it was more than a friend's death. It was the end of the illusion that he could live between both worlds. The studios began distancing themselves. Contracts dissolved. His reputation as too connected cost him roles that could have saved his career. He was never convicted of a crime, never even charged. But in Hollywood, guilt by association was enough. By the 1950s, he was performing in Vegas, not as a star, but as a host, greeting gamblers, shaking hands, smiling through nostalgia. The same mob that once lifted him up now used his name as decoration for their casinos. He had become part of the furniture, a reminder of when Hollywood and the underworld were inseparable. In his later years, he spoke of loyalty with sadness rather than pride. He had protected people who never protected him, and yet, even in regret, he refused to expose anyone. He went to his grave insisting he'd never been a gangster, only a friend. But everyone who knew him understood. George Raft didn't just play gangsters. He was the bridge between the world that built them and the world that worshipped them. He had danced with the mob, and for a while he led. But when the music stopped, the only thing left was silence. Robert Mitchum, the star who survived the system. Robert Mitchum never wanted to be a hero. He wasn't built for the Hollywood machine. Too blunt, too calm, too honest for a town that lived on illusions. But somehow, that's exactly why he became a legend. By the 1940s, Mitchum was one of the most bankable leading men in America. He played loners, drifters, men who carried danger in their eyes. What audiences didn't know was how close those characters were to the real man behind them. Because unlike most of his peers, Mitchum wasn't afraid of the people who truly ran Hollywood's shadows. He grew up around them. Before acting, Mitchum worked odd jobs across the country. Prize fighter, laborer, nightclub bouncer. He knew the language of men who lived outside the law, and he spoke it fluently. That gave him an edge on screen. But off-screen, it gave him credibility with the underworld figures who floated through Los Angeles. He frequented the same nightclubs that Mickey Cohen's men controlled, drank with gamblers, and joked with the same fixers who handled stars' reputations. But Mitchum wasn't one of them. He understood their world, but he never belonged to it. He didn't need protection, and that made him dangerous in a different way. In 1948, his image of rebellion nearly ended his career. He was arrested at a private house party for marijuana possession, a scandal that could have destroyed anyone else. Within hours, the story hit every front page. Movie idol caught in drug raid. For a brief moment, the studio panicked. But then something strange happened. Instead of hiding, Mitchum leaned into it. He smiled for the cameras during his mugshot, shrugged during interviews, and said, "It's just a case of bad publicity." The public loved it. The bad boy image became his brand. Hollywood, always eager to sell a story, realized they couldn't cancel him. He was too authentic. Behind the scenes, the same network that had protected countless stars, mob fixers, studio lawyers, and advisors, quietly made sure his sentence was short and his comeback fast. Some say Mickey Cohen himself intervened, ensuring the arrest didn't escalate into something bigger. No one ever proved it, but it wouldn't have been unusual. In those years, even justice in Los Angeles had a price tag. After his release, Mitchum's stardom only grew. He became the anti-hero of post-war America, the man who didn't care what anyone thought. He worked with Sinatra, befriended outcasts, and refused to bow to the studio system. He was too unpredictable to control, and that made him untouchable. He once told a reporter, "I don't have to act. I just show up and they pay me." But that was only half the truth. He acted every day, just not on screen. He acted like he didn't care, because caring in Hollywood was how people got crushed through the 1950s and 60s. As other stars faded under scandal, Mitchum endured. He didn't need protection from the mob or the studios, because he had built something they couldn't buy: credibility. He could walk into Mickey Cohen's club or a studio executive's mansion and be treated exactly the same, with respect and a little fear. He watched others fall, stars who owed too many favors, producers who lost everything when their backers changed sides. He survived because he never owed anyone anything. And in a world built on debt and secrets, that was the rarest power of all. By the time he grew older, Mitchum had become a symbol of authenticity, a relic of a Hollywood that no longer existed. When asked how he'd survived so long in an industry built on manipulation, he smiled and said, "I kept my mouth shut, my head down, and my conscience clean." It wasn't the mob that saved Robert Mitchum. It was his refusal to play their game. And maybe that's why he outlived them all. The last man standing in a city that never forgave anyone for knowing too much. Bugsy Siegel, the gangster who tried to become Hollywood. Bugsy Siegel didn't want to be remembered as a killer. He wanted to be remembered as a visionary. To him, the mob wasn't just business, it was show business. And nowhere captured that fantasy better than Hollywood. By the late 1930s, Siegel was one of the most recognizable names in organized crime. He had money, charm, and connections that reached from New York to Los Angeles. But unlike his partners, he didn't want to rule from the shadows. He wanted to be seen. Hollywood gave him that chance. He dressed like a star, drove the same cars as actors, and threw parties that made studio moguls jealous. At his mansion in Beverly Hills, movie stars, politicians, and mob figures drank from the same glasses. A collision of two empires built on illusion. Everyone loved Siegel because he didn't act like a gangster. He acted like a celebrity. He invested in films, dated actresses, and funded nightclubs that doubled as meeting places for producers and mob investors. When police raided those clubs, the names in the guest books were quietly erased. For the studios, Siegel's money solved problems. For Siegel, Hollywood gave him something he'd never had before: legitimacy. But there was a limit to how much legitimacy a gangster could buy. Siegel's biggest dream and downfall was Las Vegas. He envisioned a paradise in the desert, casinos run like palaces, entertainers headlining grand stages, money flowing through every table and theater. He called it the Flamingo. Hollywood laughed at first. A luxury casino in the middle of nowhere sounded like madness. But Siegel didn't care. He convinced investors, many of them his mob partners, to finance the project. He also courted Hollywood's elite, promising them front row seats in a city that would soon belong to them. But the project bled money. Construction costs doubled, then tripled. Millions vanished through bad deals, theft, and mismanagement. Rumors spread that Siegel was skimming funds. Rumors that didn't sit well with the men who had financed him. He tried to save the Flamingo by making it glamorous. He flew in performers from Los Angeles, hired dancers, musicians, and designers to create a spectacle worthy of the movies. When it finally opened in 1946, the press called it Hollywood in the Desert, but the crowds didn't come. The first week was a disaster, and the men who had invested weren't known for forgiving failure. In June 1947, as Siegel sat in his Beverly Hills home reading the newspaper, a bullet shattered the window and ended his life instantly. The murder was never solved. Officially, no one was charged. Unofficially, everyone knew it was a message. The next morning, his partners took control of the Flamingo. Within months, it became the crown jewel of Las Vegas, the city Siegel had dreamed of. Hollywood stars flocked there, performing for crowds of mob-backed high rollers. What he built out of vision, others would turn into profit. For a while, his name was taboo. The studios distanced themselves and the press sanitized the story. But over time, Hollywood changed its mind. They turned him into legend, the charming outlaw, the gangster with class. Movies romanticized him, songs mentioned him, and the Flamingo still bore his ghost. What they never mentioned was the truth. Bugsy Siegel didn't just bring the mob to Las Vegas, he brought Hollywood there too. He proved that organized crime and organized entertainment were built on the same foundation: illusion, loyalty, and money that always flowed in the dark. He wanted to be a movie star. He ended up becoming something far more dangerous: the man who showed Hollywood what the mob could look like in a tuxedo. And though he died young, his dream didn't. Every casino, every showroom, every spotlight on the Vegas Strip still carries his reflection. The man who turned crime into a brand. Mickey Cohen, the king of Los Angeles. Mickey Cohen wasn't born into the Hollywood dream. He took it. In a city obsessed with fame, he understood that power wasn't about who you were, but who you could reach. By the time the 1940s began, Los Angeles didn't belong to the movie moguls or the politicians. It belonged to him. He started small, a boxer turned bookmaker, a street enforcer turned businessman. But where others saw risk, Cohen saw opportunity. Hollywood was full of people who needed protection, from gossip, from debt, from themselves. And Mickey Cohen was always willing to help for a price. He ran his empire from a tailor shop on Sunset Boulevard, a front that welcomed everyone, from studio executives to movie stars. Behind the curtains, it was something else entirely: a nerve center of extortion, gambling, and influence that reached all the way into City Hall. He paid off police, controlled unions, and decided who got to operate where. In Los Angeles, nothing happened without his approval. To the press, Cohen was a spectacle. He wore $1,000 suits, drove Cadillacs, and gave interviews as if he were a movie star himself. And in a way, he was a celebrity gangster, perfectly cast for Hollywood's obsession with bad men who look good. But his real power came from his relationships. He was close to actors like George Raft and singers like Frank Sinatra. men who moved between legitimate fame and the shadow world that financed it. He hosted parties that blurred the line between criminal and cultural elite. At his gatherings, you might see a senator, a producer, and a hitman sitting at the same table, laughing about the same headlines. Cohen didn't just enjoy the attention, he used it. He controlled nightclubs that doubled as safe havens for Hollywood's biggest secrets. If a scandal needed to disappear, Cohen could make it happen. If a reporter dug too deep, he could make them stop. He wasn't just feared, he was necessary. But every empire draws enemies. After World War II, the FBI intensified its pursuit of organized crime. Wiretaps, raids, and testimonies began peeling away Cohen's protective layers. He became too visible, too noisy, too powerful for the men who preferred silence. In 1951, federal agents raided his home in Beverly Hills. Television crews arrived to film the arrest. The once untouchable King of Los Angeles in handcuffs under the bright California sun. The city that had once admired him now watched him fall. Cohen served time for tax evasion, the same charge that brought down Al Capone, but prison didn't destroy him. He returned to Los Angeles after his release, older but unbroken, and found that people still lined up to meet him. Reporters, actors, and fans treated him like a relic from a glamorous, dangerous past. He signed autographs, gave interviews, and even published his memoirs. He called himself a businessman, not a gangster. And in a sense, he was right. He had turned crime into an industry built on image as much as intimidation. By the time he died in 1976, Mickey Cohen had outlived most of his rivals and nearly every one of his protected friends. Hollywood had changed, but his fingerprints were still everywhere. In the way power operated behind the scenes, in the unspoken deals between studios and their investors, in the idea that fame could be negotiated like a contract. He once told a reporter, "I never shot a movie, but Hollywood still ran through me." He wasn't lying. Mickey Cohen had mastered the one rule of Los Angeles. If you couldn't be a star, you could always own the stars who needed you. Johnny Rosselli, so the fixer who knew everyone. Johnny Rosselli was the man who smiled in every room. The kind of presence that could calm a room full of egos. He wasn't loud like Bugsy Siegel or flamboyant like Mickey Cohen. He was quiet, polished, and impossibly well-connected. In a city built on secrets, Johnny Rosselli knew them all. Born Filippo Sacco in Italy and raised in Chicago, Rosselli worked his way through the criminal ranks during Prohibition. But unlike most gangsters, he didn't stay in the shadows. He dressed better than actors, spoke softly, and understood something most mobsters never did. Power didn't always come from fear, it came from access. In the 1930s, he was sent to Los Angeles by Chicago outfit boss Al Capone's successors, tasked with representing their interests in the film industry. Hollywood was full of money and very few rules. The perfect place for someone like Rosselli. He didn't threaten people, he made things happen. He found lost investments, settled debts, and negotiated contracts that no one else could. If a studio needed funding for a risky film, Rosselli knew who could provide it. If a troublesome gossip columnist needed to back off, he knew how to make that happen too. People called him the Fixer, and for 2 decades he lived up to the title. He became close friends with stars like George Raft, Frank Sinatra, and even producers who pretended not to know who he really was. He attended premieres, charity balls, and private dinners. He was always on the guest list, and never in the headlines. When Las Vegas began booming in the 1940s and 50s, Rosselli became the bridge between Hollywood's investors and the mob's casino bosses. He arranged deals for entertainers, brought movie stars to perform in mob-owned hotels, and ensured everyone walked away happy, or at least quiet. Even the FBI admitted they couldn't touch him. He was too sophisticated, too careful, too charming. Agents described him as the gentleman gangster. But what made Rosselli truly dangerous wasn't what he did. It was what he knew. He had dirt on everyone. Studio heads who took bribes, actors who owed gambling debts, politicians who looked the other way. He could destroy careers with a single conversation, and everyone knew it. By the 1960s, Rosselli's connections reached far beyond Hollywood. He worked with the CIA during the Cold War, helping with operations that blurred the line between patriotism and crime. In those years, he was no longer just fixing deals for studios. He was navigating the intersection of power itself, entertainment, politics, and espionage. But no one stays untouchable forever. By the 1970s, the world had changed. New crime bosses didn't value subtlety, they valued obedience. The FBI's pressure mounted, and old alliances crumbled. Roselli's name resurfaced in Senate hearings investigating organized crime. And suddenly, the man who once knew everything was being asked to explain it. He cooperated, carefully. But in the mob, careful isn't always enough. In 1976, Johnny Roselli vanished. A few weeks later, a fisherman near Miami discovered a metal drum floating in the bay. Inside was Roselli's body. The message was clear. The fixer had finally run out of favors. His death shocked Hollywood, not because anyone was surprised, but because it reminded them how deep the old connection still ran. The polite man who had walked every red carpet had been living in two worlds all along. Johnny Roselli was the quiet architect of a dangerous alliance, the man who kept Hollywood's hands clean while the mob counted the profits. He had built bridges where no one else could, and in the end, it was those same bridges that led him to the water. He knew too much, and in Hollywood, that's never a good ending. When the curtain finally fell, it wasn't the stars who owned Hollywood. It was the silence. A silence built by men who knew too much and kept it that way. George Raft had danced his way between two worlds until both forgot him. Bugsy Siegel tried to make crime look beautiful and paid for his dream in blood. Johnny Roselli thought he could balance power forever until the weight of his secrets dragged him beneath the water. Mickey Cohen ruled Los Angeles like a movie set, but every empire made of fear eventually crumbles. And Robert Mitchum, the one who never played by their rules, walked away untouched, not because he was cleaner, but because he was smarter. They were reflections of a time when Hollywood wasn't just about fame, it was about control. The studios wrote the stories, the mob financed the dreams, and the people who stood in between became legends or ghosts. As the years passed, the names changed, but the game didn't. The power simply learned how to dress better, in contracts, in headlines, in corporate smiles instead of gunfire, but the same shadows lingered behind the lights. In the end, these men didn't just shape Hollywood. They were Hollywood, dangerous, brilliant, corrupt, and unforgettable. Their stories remind us that the brightest lights cast the longest shadows, and that in the city built on dreams, those who knew the truth rarely lived long enough to tell it.